Okay, you are all in for a fantastic treat. One of our students has asked me, what is this? This is like the London Blitz. So I don't hope I impose too much trauma on this, but what we're going to do is what I've encountered myself many times as something called a science slam. And it is basically a format that's quite different from what you're used to, in that we will have many presenters, and each one of them will get only 5 minutes to talk about their project and their direction that they're going. This will be fast, dynamic, and unconventional, as we are here at Michigan. And so the way this will work is the speakers will cycle up onto the stage, and there's a timer, and when the timer goes off, time is up. So here we go. With no further ado, our first person is Armen Abkarian, and I will signal to you when the timer goes on.
Great.
I need to first do this. Okay. 5 minutes. Here you go.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for this final panel called Future Flashes. So over the course of the past year as a member of the Armenian Studies program, I focused mainly on alternative means of producing and transmitting knowledge in 13th and 14th century Armenian literature. Specifically, what I focused on until now are colophons of Armenian manuscripts. So briefly, colophons are just annotations that scribes would make in the manuscripts that they were copying, and they varied widely in terms of their form and function. So in past scholarship, colophons have been lauded in terms of their narrative information, their ability to plot historical data on a timeline. But after I came to Michigan, I decided to switch gears, and I chose to explore colophons in terms of their as spaces of scribal agency. So what I mean by that is, because there was such a variation in colophons, scribes had a significant degree of latitude with regards to how these manuscripts were read and understood. For example, some colophons were embedded into the actual body of the text rather than being written in the margins. In other examples, you have scribes writing about or making associations between themselves or their patrons, and sometimes characters within the actual text that they were writing. So over the summer, after the first year, over the summer, I wanted to switch gears again, and I wanted to apply a similar approach, this time to the poetry attributed to Frik. So Frik was ostensibly a 13th to 14th century Armenian poet who witnessed, ostensibly, the consolidation by the Mongols of Iran and Anatolia. So I chose to conduct a close reading of a single poem to speculate on its intended audience and how it was meant to be read and understood. I paid special attention to emotionally evocative language, loanwords from Persian, Arabic, and Turkish, and outside literary and biblical associations. So specifically, the poem that I chose is entitled Regarding Argun Khan and Buğra. It's an account of a failed coup attempt on the part of a preeminent Mongol officer named Buğra against the then Khan of Iran and Anatolia named Argun. This was in the late 13th century. The tone of the poem is decidedly pro-Argun. It discusses him in terms of his legitimacy, his descent from Chinggis Khan, and Buğra is brought up as biting the hand that feeds. So in the past, scholars have read Frik literally in the same way as they have for the colophons to plot points on the historical timeline or substantiate historical details, but there are some problems associated with this. One is that they take the identity of Frik for granted. So the only information we have on Frik's existence comes from his own writings, things that are attributed to him. This has led various scholars to speculate on his identity. Maybe Frik was a pen name. And however, taking Frik's identity for granted has also led to other problematic statements, such as taking biographical data for granted. Our own Michael Pfeiffer has written about this in Stranger's Voice. No. Oh, okay. In Stranger's Voice, where he debates how some literary conventions could be mistaken for biographical data. So another problem is the dating of the manuscript. The earliest extant manuscript that we have comes to us from 1513, and if that is the earliest manuscript, it's possible that Frik wasn't a contemporary of Argun at all, and this is all a back projection. So just to wrap up, I will just say that this project is still in the formative stages, and I welcome any advice or suggestions or critiques on where I can take this. I would just like to say that because of the lack of tangible details about Frik, his identity, his writing, I feel that a literary approach to Frik would be more productive than a literal one. Thank you.
All right, I go. Hi everyone, I research contemporary Armenian culture life through the lens of literature, but also film and other media. Since I'm speaking to a diverse audience of academicians and non-academics and non-academicians, I will start with 4 axioms. Here we go. Then I will turn to Oshagan for inspiration. So take a moment and read some of this stuff. I have in mind especially the second definition for the axiom, hoping that the third will become the case in the near future, and I'm certainly open to debating in the spirit of the first definition. Regarding number 1, when I use the more commonly accepted term Armenian diaspora, I have in mind a way of thinking and being that is compatible with and enriching to a nation-state idea, so it's not an opposition, in particular in relation to the Republic of Armenia. Regarding number 2, it is in the interest of this diaspora to understand and embrace its conditions of post-catastrophic dispersion and to do so in a non-zero-sum fashion. Otherwise, it will lose its opportunity to reach its potential culturally, politically, and economically. This means that any unachievable, simplistic, and nostalgic notions of return are not helpful because they exhaust and paralyze global Armenian cultural life. Number 3, instead of belonging to one culture or another, rather in a totalizing or in a totalitarian manner, diaspora Armenians participate in Armenian cultural life, as well as in those of others. Number 4, as I understand, as a standardized literary language, Western Armenian should be individually and collectively, institutionally, prioritized by at least some, but not necessarily by all diaspora Armenians, as a language that on the one hand can tie globally dispersed Armenians, keep them tied to their inherited culture, but also being the medium of forging new diaspora cultural configurations. Now, I draw these axioms from Vahé Oshagan. To my knowledge, he is the poet, writer, and intellectual who, more than anyone else, has contributed to and practiced such a vision of Armenian culture life. So here I'll read this short passage for you. And notice it's from 1965. For about half a century, our history has come to a halt. It has run out of gas. We're seated around it arguing who is the best Armenian among us. But history is culture, that is the radiance of intellectual power, the mirror when looking into which a person or a nation, a politician or a meeting of diabetic sovereigns, for a moment we seem to receive something resembling meaning. The crisis of diaspora is the crisis of being left out of the marathon of history, fatigue, disappointment, laziness, impotence. Who cares? Our crisis is a moral crisis, the cause of which can be the fact of being thrown away from our native land, but the solution of which has undoubtedly nothing to do with native land. We are the masters of our meaningless destinies, and what is fundamental is not the romantic land mixed with ashes or living nose to nose within the traditional borders. For us who push to overflow in and out, do not even correspond to ourselves. For us who will understand what land is only in the graveyard, but belonging to a culture. What is the culture of diaspora? And if we did not have a culture, if we did not have a past, we probably would be able to create an authentic culture for us much more easily. And this is 1965. Moving forward. For more than a half a century, Vahé Oshagan wrote groundbreaking poetry, literary criticism, as well as prose and plays, and certainly did not shy away from being provocative. he carved out for himself and for others the role of a free-thinking intellectual and a writer, that is, as someone whose pen and thought does not have to obey national ideological demands. At the same time, Oshagan was a lifelong member of the Armenian Revolutionary Federation. The Dashnagdutun was for that reason barred from visiting Soviet Armenia. 1 minute, right? Yeah. Yes. I'm almost done. Visiting Soviet Armenia, went there immediately afterwards, after independence, and actually taught in Stepanakert, Artsakh during the war in the 1990s. As a postdoctoral fellow at Manoogian fellow at Michigan here, I'm working on a book on Vahé Oshagan. It is going to present his rich legacy by tying it with Francophone and Anglophone literary currents after the war, as well as in relation to the diaspora Armenian literary movement. At stake is understanding diaspora studies, but also inspiring diaspora Armenians, as well as thinking about multilingual cultural and translation studies, stateless power, and all of the other things. Thank you. Done.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Tuğçe, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Middle East Studies and Women's Studies. So I would like to start by thanking to ASB program, Melanie Tanelyan and Naira Tumanyan for making this event happen. Today, I will briefly introduce a chapter from my dissertation and forthcoming article. In my dissertation titled Bodies in War, Politics of Sexuality and War Orphans in the Late Ottoman Empire, I explored the measures and regulations that the Ottoman government and its institutional allies, including but not limited to medicine, family, and educational institutions, deployed to regulate sexual behaviors and orientations of war orphans against the backdrop of the representation of proper youth sexuality as opposed to the deviant orphan imagery. Each of my chapters focus on particular stigmatized sexual practice, and in this chapter, Condemnation of Male Same-Sex Desire and Practices, I discuss the stigmatization of male homoerotic desires through a particular case that took place in an orphanage in the city of Konya, vis-a-vis the state and non-state actors' representations of ideal masculinities. The particular incident that I focus on in this chapter involved a 15-year-old orphan boy and a 20-year-old orphanage administrator. One night, these two young men were caught in the bed of the latter in an inappropriately intimate situation. This is a quote. Their case, which was concluded by their being expelled from the orphanage, was only one of the many similar cases that reflected the moral panic around deviant sexual practices within youth. This was an anxiety that occurred as an outcome of the institutionalization of heterosexual sex as a norm, as a part of the wartime politics, I argue in my chapter. I start my chapter by offering an analysis of three idealized representations of masculinity in the early 20th Ottoman society, which were Little Mehmet, a new interpretation of masculinity within the youth of Mevlevi order in Konya, and lastly High Scout, an Armenian Boy Scout organization based in Paris and organized the young survivors of the genocide. Then I move on to the regulation of sexual pleasure and the means to experience it, and why and how male same-sex desires came to be perceived as a danger to the morals and socio-political order, and why war orphans were seen to be inclined to involve in such deviant practices. I can't see, it's 2 minutes, okay. My project is at the intersection of history, transnational sexuality studies, childhood studies, and Middle Eastern studies. I deploy macro and micro historical approaches to identify the function of the wartime politics of sexuality in cultivating the subjective and national belongings of war orphans at local, imperial, and transnational levels. In my analysis of the development of sexual fetishes on the bodies of orphan children and their representation in the ideological landscape, I offer a historical and discursive analysis of medical, literary, and official texts by employing morality and sexuality as my categories of analysis. I rely on historical and feminist approaches to homoeroticism and heterosexuality, as well as psychoanalytic interpretations of sexual deviancy, as I analyze its connection to the patriarchal moral discourses in the early 20th century Ottoman society. Feminist theories and epistemologies incorporating intersectionality and psychoanalytic frameworks and positioning one's subjective identity concerning existing power structures allow me to situate the politics of sexuality over war orphans vis-a-vis the politics of morality as formational dynamics in the construction of heterosexual and masculine wartime citizens. By doing so, my work offers a contribution to the growing studies on the home front during World War I by bringing in politics of sexuality with particular focus on outcasted youth. So thank you. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's mine. I'm taking it. Okay. Can I have extra? Great. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. So since it's a slam, I thought I'll do some beatboxing and some dancing, but I didn't want to disappoint Melanie. So instead, I'll say that I'm so happy to be here, and thanks Melanie and Nayura for organizing that and inviting me to be here and bearing with me, given who I am. So the project that I would like to tell you about today has been enabled at its very early stages by the Armenian Studies program, so it's especially thrilling for me to be here. And to tell you how that concept has actually evolved into a fully fledged project by now. Oh, fair warning to everyone. This does not deal with the time period before 14th century. So if that's not real history, I apologize. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the statement that wars make state. But what exactly does that mean? And that's the type of question that I'm tackling in my project. And I tackle it through two specific questions. The question number one is, when the conflict becomes part and parcel of everyday life, when it's embedded in social fabric, what type of bearing does it have on government's accountability towards its people? And what I mean by that specifically is government's willingness to provide public goods, things like paving roads and building schools. Does the presence of conflict serve as some kind of pretext for the government to say, well, we should siphon some resources from butter to guns, use it as a rally behind the flag type of cry? Or, by contrast, might it bring political forces together to pursue new initiatives? And the second related question to that is, what's the relationship between conflict dynamics and public opinion? In other words, does the population is more likely to forgive certain political mishaps to justify the government because of this shadow of war looming in the background? Or might it depend? Well, and I'll be a very notorious academic here and tell you that my answer is it's complicated. So why is it so complicated? The reason it's complicated and the reason we have very few results in the field concerning this question, and the results are all over the place, is for two primary reasons, which is primarily the paucity of data. What do I mean by that? If you were to go to one of the most authoritative data sets on conflict, and if you were to try to find some information about the conflict over Artsakh, you will find only a few incidents mentioned in the course of almost 3 decades. So of course we know that that's not exactly the reflection of the reality, and that the conflict does change much more frequently than what's reflected there. And if you were to go to such an authoritative database as the World Bank to look up what are the public goods that are being provided to the population, what will you find out? Well, how much is spent on an education in a particular year. It doesn't tell us who gets it, how is it spread geographically, how much is really being spent on different projects. So as a political scientist who has been trained by historians, anthropologists, and literary scholars, I was, of course, very much disturbed by the lack of richness in this ability to construct a more nuanced chronology. And so what I tried to do is to figure out what type of sources might I use. I couldn't use any of the data sets that I told you about. I couldn't necessarily refer to the government documents because what I was interested in was this nexus between the popular demands and the governmental responses. And so I ended up looking at newspapers. Oh, no beeping? Not yet, yes. So I ended up settling on 7 different newspapers covering the time period between 2000 and 2017. And of course, given that newspapers contain bias and inconsistency, I ended up settling on newspapers that were representing a spectrum of views, in part to balance for those misgivings. And as of now, we have coded, processed almost 50,000 articles. I would not have been able to do that by myself, and as of this stage, I managed to build up a 20-person research lab, so if any of you will see students coming into your classrooms being really enthusiastic and saying that all roads lead not to Rome but to Armenia, I will take the full blame and credit for that. So what we managed to get out of that is both information about the conflict dynamics, how does it change almost on a daily basis, as well as what is being built where, even if it's something small as a fountain. And now I assume that I need to keep you in suspense. Please come back in a year and I'll tell you more about my hopefully not preliminary results by then. Thank you.
Hello everyone, this is Özge Korkmaz. I'm a doctoral candidate in the Department of Anthropology here at University of Michigan. I've just come back from my 2-year-long fieldwork in Turkey's Kurdistan. And I'm really happy for Ohannes's presentation earlier today, because without his very extensive and nuanced examination of the issue, it would be really hard for me to make sense right now in only 5 minutes. So here are the things that I'm going to talk about, not in this particular order. I'm going to talk about Bruki tribe of Van and why their case might be a little strange for us. So Van is the very eastern province of Turkey. It is the second biggest province in the predominantly Kurdish populated southeast part of the country. But one can say it's a very cosmopolitan place too, because there are sizable, and if not sizable, visible Kyrgyz, Uzbek, Azeri, and Turkish communities living there too, except for Armenians. And only a little bit over 100 years ago, there was a remarkable, rich, vivid Armenian community living there. So how do people remember this particular community, and how do people remember that particular past? Before Van, I did fieldwork in various other places in Kurdistan, and my findings about this remembrance were in line with what Ohannes said earlier today. In general, I received sympathy, recognition of what happened to Armenians, or willingness to remember that most probably all those stuff really happened to them, even though they haven't really heard about anything before. There might be sometimes, some negative reaction, but none of them were in any way systematic in terms of positioning themselves vis-a-vis Armenians as Kurds or anything like that, except for Bruki tribe in Van. The tribe members, when I first started my fieldwork there, in general gave me a very solid, and in terms of inner structures, very repetitive accounts of certain hostilities between their ancestors and Armenians 100 years ago or all the way before the genocide even. And I was a little bit surprised, because I had never been given very solid, systematic, firm answers as such before. And then I started digging in a little bit, and I realized that there is an interesting story to Bruki tribe. According to some accounts from Urfa, some other accounts from Diyarbakir, at the very beginning of 17th century, Brukis emigrated towards Caucasia. Most of them ended up in Yerevan. And about 300 years after this happened, in 1919, they returned back down towards the current Turkish Kurdistan, and they relocated in Van because they found a lot of Armenian villages left behind, and they started living there. And most of the accounts provided to me by the Brukis were reflective of some kind of pre-Armenian genocide era framework in which Armenians and Kurds, especially Kurds, because I can't claim that I know much about how Armenians remember that part of their history, but especially for Kurds, the ultimate political and sociological other was the Armenians. which brings us back to what Hamid Bozarslan actually gives us a very strong narrative in terms of how only 100 years ago for Kurds, for the Kurdish nationalistic discourse and the rising Kurdish nationalists, the ultimate other against which they were placing themselves and vis-a-vis they were generating strategies were actually Armenians. They did not want to work with the British, let's say, because they believed Brits would actually, in the end, support a free Armenian state. In the very area, they actually wanted to build a free Kurdish state, and they stayed with the Turks. They went into the Greco-Turkish war with Turks in the end. So, and in terms of, and for me, this small little story of Bruki tribe, which is actually not that strange in the end, tells me something about how we should be thinking about responsibility and blame with respect to what we understand of as history making, and how it is all about actually finding, reading your own agency and your own group's agency in the historical accounts. People do draft narratives of their own. Thanks a lot for listening to me. Have a nice day.
Let's see if I can do this in 5 minutes. Hi, everyone. My name is Simone, and I'm a second-year PhD student in the history department. Between 1870 and 1918, 232 ethnic Armenians graduated from Beirut's nascent medical schools, 134 from AUB's medical school, and 98 from the Faculty of Medicine of the Université Saint-Joseph de Beirut. These Armenians were part of successive waves of medical graduates and scientists who came to the US to complete their residencies as early as the last quarter of the 19th century. Few returned back to the region, many ended up remaining here and contributed to the production of medico-scientific knowledge. One of them was early 20th century radiologist Mihran Krikor-Kasabyan. Other names include Stanford psychiatrist Hrant Khachadurian and Dr. Avedis Donabedian, the creator of the Donabedian model of care, employed today by health insurance companies and hospitals in the US. Now, you might be wondering, how I got here in my research interest. My answer would be that it was an issue of historiography. As soon as I joined U of M, exactly a year ago, I made the decision of getting out of my academic comfort zone. After all, if attending a French Catholic school in the suburbs of Beirut for 15 years taught me anything, it is a perpetual sense of guilt and the mastery of the art of self-flagellation. So I took a history of sexuality seminar with Professor Gail Rubin. The Euro-American centricism of the class's medical readings on sex pushed me to embark on a journey of extensive research with the aim of unearthing any Arabic textual sources remotely similar to what I had encountered in this seminar. To my delight, in the pages of the late 19th century Arabic and popular science journals such as Al-Muqtataf, meaning the digest, Al-Kulliya, meaning the college, and At-Tabib, meaning the doctor, I found a number of Arab psychiatrists and physicians who were writing about gender and sexuality and the social and moral parameters of what was allowed and prohibited in sex, basing their authority on a new form of power, that is, their medical and scientific expertise. This eventually became the topic of my first original long research paper that I wrote in the winter term of this past year. Over the summer, in anticipation of having to teach a course on the history of US psychiatry from 1800 to the present this term, I started familiarizing myself with the recently published literature on the history of medicine and the sciences in the 19th century and 20th centuries. And after gaining access to the yearly rosters of medical graduates of AUB and Université Saint-Joseph, I created a set of Excel sheets where I classified these doctors by specialization and area and city of residence. And that is how I came to the number that I mentioned at the beginning. To make things clear, my envisioned project will not examine the work and research of these American physicians and Armenian physicians and psychiatrists in silo. Rather, I will study them along with their colleagues from the Levant, their research contributions, praxis, and labor as agents and vectors of transmission of and reception and appropriation of knowledge and skills in transnational spaces. The following are the questions that I would like to tackle. First are the question of the scientific method and the production of medico-scientific knowledge. Born out of the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th century, modern science is widely thought as a purely Western European creation. The argument is that because it was founded on medical reasoning, this immutable universalist knowledge can be diffused to and appropriated by all humans. It is thus deemed as ecumenical. Yet in the past 2 decades, philosophers, sociologists, and historians of modern science have successfully challenged this claimed unity of modern knowledge practices across the West. In place of a unique modern science, this recent corpus of literature has maintained the existence of many national and local knowledge traditions and dynamics. These have spread across North America and West Europe with diverse and at times contradictory intellectual agendas and influences throughout the early modern and modern periods. In brief, my aim is to flesh out the philosophical, moral, and political values in the scientific knowledge produced by these transnational men and women of science. In my study of the construction and elaboration, reconfiguration, and application of this knowledge, I plan to focus on the material, instrumental, corporal, pragmatic, and cognitive dimensions of these processes. My second intervention would be in the area of 20th century migrations of medico-scientific labor, since my work aims to highlight local and global entanglements of often erased and nationally demarcated histories of medicine. I will obviously look at Armenian, Lebanese, and Syrian, and other diasporic networks. These networks were crucial for these migrations, providing vital material, ideological, and logistical resources, and impacting who was able to migrate and where they were able to settle, conduct, and practice their research. By overlaying the social, i.e. gender, race, ethnicity, and other markers of difference, and categories of inclusion and exclusion, just 10 seconds. By overlaying the social and the spatial, I eschew a reductive view of networks and look to further investigate the mechanisms and complexities related to the entry and participation of these foreign doctors into the medico-scientific labor workforce of the United States.
Thank you so much, Manu. Thank you all so much. My name is Anush Tamar Suni, and I am one of the 2 Manoogian postdoctoral fellows this year. I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you to the Armenian Studies program for hosting me this year, and to Melanie and Naida for organizing this fantastic conference, and thank you all for staying till the very end. So today, I'm going to give a brief snapshot of my dissertation project, in which I investigated the afterlives, remnants, and local memory of the material cultural heritage of the Armenian community in the province of Van in eastern Turkey. For this project, I carried out 2 years of ethnographic fieldwork, mostly in Van, but also in Istanbul and Yerevan, between 2015 and 2017. My primary sources were the interviews that I conducted with individuals who lived in or were originally from Van in Kurdish, Turkish, and Armenian, along with my field notes. The principal questions that guided my research were: how does the history of the Ottoman Armenians continue to animate everyday life in contemporary Eastern Turkey? How does the 1915 genocide intersect with the current politics and concerns of the Kurdish community, and how is it remembered today? And what are the afterlives of the Armenian material heritage in Van since 1915? One of the main concerns of my research were the fates of the monumental Armenian churches and monasteries of the Van region. You can see 2 examples of such monasteries in the photographs on the backgrounds of the slides. The first that you saw is the Garmuravank Monastery in Kitaevich, and the second, this one, is the dome of the main church in Hokiatsvank Monastery in the Norduz region. As part of my dissertation, I outlined the varied trajectories of these structures, some of which are still standing, while others have fallen into ruin. Some have been simply abandoned, like the Garmuravank Monastery, which is visited mostly by shepherds who seek shelter there. Others have been taken over by villagers who use them as storehouses for hay or household items, or stables for their livestock. Still others have been repurposed as a school, as a mosque, or even as a house. A very small number, including the most famous of them all, the 10th century church of Akhtamar, have been recently officially restored and open for tourism. and a few others are lucky to have sympathetic neighbors, such as the monastery of Varakavank, where a local Kurdish villager acts as an informal guardian, keeping the interior of the church clean and patching up holes in the roof while he waits year after year for the government to undertake a formal restoration. Many have also been completely or partially destroyed, either because villagers dismantled the structures in order to reuse the stones to build their houses, or because of an official decree, such as in the monastery of Narek, which was demolished by order of the local governor in 1950. Finally, most, if not all, Armenian sites are frequently visited by hopeful treasure hunters who illegally dig wherever they can, in the floors, walls, domes, or in the exteriors of these churches, seeking to unearth mythical buried gold. Of all the sites that I visited during my fieldwork, it was this church, Hokiatsvank, also known as the Convent of the Spirits, where I had the most surprising encounter, and one which demonstrated to me how the Armenian past of the region and the built environment of the departed Armenians still plays a dynamic role in the everyday lives and the historical memory of the local Kurdish community, and a few of you here have already heard the story. I traveled to the monastery, which is a 1-hour drive south of Van, and then another 1-hour hike from the closest village in 2016, along with 3 Kurdish friends. When we arrived at the village, we stopped and asked a local woman how we could reach the church. And she poked her head into the car and asked us, first, if we had brought our own rooster, or if we needed to purchase one, and second, which of us could not have children. This bewildered us, but just then, a second car transporting a family of 4 pulled up behind us, and they also asked directions for the church. The village woman asked them the same questions, and, totally unfazed by her queries, they replied that they had indeed brought their own rooster, and that it was the young woman in their party who could not have children, and thus it was for her that they were making the journey. The arrival of this family was fortuitous for us, as we were able to join them as we hiked together to the ruined monastery. There, they sacrificed their rooster, and they prayed for a healthy pregnancy for the young woman. Through this encounter, we understood that this monastery had more significance to the locals than simply being a dilapidated old church. It is now an active pilgrimage site that Muslim Kurds visit in order to seek fertility and healthy children. Thus, it is not a static, melancholic space embodying a violent past, but a site in which locals engage with that destroyed past in the present and seek a hopeful future. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Anna Kitaevich. I am an undergraduate student here at the university studying linguistics. I want to thank first Professor Jallatyan and the Armenian Studies Department for inviting me to speak here today. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the work I'm doing for my honors thesis in linguistics, which involves investigating heritage language acquisition and bilingualism in the context of Western Armenian and the diaspora. And I first became interested in bilingualism as a research assistant working on projects that involve this topic. And my background as a member of the Armenian community made me curious about the English Western Armenian bilingualism that exists within my own community. And so first I want to talk about, I want to start with the question, what is a heritage language? A heritage language is pretty much any language that is spoken in the home that is not the dominant language of a given society. So in the US, this is any language other than English. And a heritage speaker is somebody who grows up in a home where a language other than the dominant language is spoken and who is bilingual to some degree in the heritage language and the dominant language. And so my research will look at Western Armenian heritage speakers in the community of Southeast Michigan. The research questions that are driving my research are first, what is the nature of the knowledge of Western Armenian that these speakers possess? And also, how does speaker knowledge vary according to according to variables related to their language background. For example, does knowledge vary based on whether both parents spoke Armenian in the home or if only one parent? If only one parent spoke Armenian, which parent was it? Did the speaker receive any schooling, and what age did they start acquiring Western Armenian? And so a little bit about how I'm going to be investigating these questions is first through oral production elicitation tasks, which target the production or the use of the language by speakers. And so with this kind of task, a speaker would complete a task that is designed to get them to use a certain structure of the language. For example, if I wanted a speaker to use past tense, I might ask them to tell me a story that happened a really long time ago. And the second type of task that I'll have speakers complete are grammaticality judgment tasks. And this targets comprehension or their understanding of the language. And in this type of task, a speaker hears a sentence and they decide whether or not that sentence sounds okay to them, it's grammatical, or whether it sounds strange to them, it's ungrammatical. And speakers will also be completing a language background questionnaire, which will help determine whether some of the variables might be affecting their knowledge of the language. And so lastly, I want to talk about why Western Armenian. Western Armenian is a very interesting case because the language actually primarily exists in bilingual communities. There are very few, if any, monolingual speakers left, especially in the US. It's also, from a linguistic perspective, the modern language is understudied. And so with my honors thesis, I would like to first understand the knowledge of Western Armenian that speakers in this community possess. And more broadly, the research will offer insights to how diaspora populations, how languages function in diaspora populations, as well as more broadly the impact. This will provide more information about bilingual language acquisition, language attrition or language loss, and language change. Thank you.
Thank you all for doing this. This was a wonderful presentation. And I know I produced a lot of anxieties about this, but I think it was really worthwhile to hear the variety of our students and to give us a little snapshot of what is to come in the future. And we added a political scientist to the room and a linguist. So therefore, I think, thank you all so very much for doing this. So I guess I scheduled some closing remarks, or maybe Naira scheduled those. And I didn't see that they were there. And so I know that has been a really long day for us, and I would really like to thank you all for traveling from as far as Ankara, the west, east, south, and north of the United States to revisit what Michael has called the laboratory. And in some cases, actually entering it for the first time. I would like to take this opportunity to once again thank Kevork, Ron, and Gerard for sharing their experiences last night and for building a program that is robust, that is vibrant from scratch, and at times perhaps against all odds. So thank you very much. And it is, of course, a great honor for me to take over this program as the new director, and for trusting it into my hands. But I would also like to really take a moment to specifically thank my immediate predecessor, with I worked the most closely in the last years and who has taken the time to introduce me into this position of leadership. Thank you, Catherine, for entrusting to me a beautiful conversation, as we saw today, a warm community. I don't think I will ever be able to live up to her generosity of heart and intellect. And she passed on to me an urgency to push the field forward into new and innovative directions. Student involvement, and as we've seen today, anthropology, sociology, comparative literature, political scientists, and linguists, were the hallmark of Catherine's 7-year tenure. She empowered the students and postdoctoral fellows of our program and creatively steered Armenian studies beyond the confines of a usually narrowly defined field, with the aim of giving young scholars a voice and a chance to become active participants, and also giving me a voice and becoming a very active participant in the program over the years. In shaping some of the intellectual themes of the program, she opened opportunities, I think, for students and postdoctoral fellows to organize workshops based on their interests. Catherine has pushed faculty and students associated to the program to enter into conversation that crossed the confines of discipline. First and foremost, she urged everyone around her, always, to ask what Armenian studies might have to offer to thematic and methodological discussions of shared history, visual culture. She allowed us to do childhood studies, Mediterranean studies, the study of gender and sexuality, and finally, last year's theme materiality, which is seemingly a very rich encounter, as we've heard today. One of our recent graduates, Zovina Dederian, speaks of this as a fundamental transformation of the program. She says, Catherine helped shape the field in ways that engage scholars from the outside, the field into the field, or from the outside of the field of Armenian studies, and encouraged those whose research topics and method had remained marginalized. Her open and dynamic vision of the future of the field gave many of us students, she says, the space to imagine new and perhaps unconventional avenues of research. And unconventional and dynamic is what we have seen today. So thank you, Catherine, for passing on the torch to me. I'm ever so grateful, and I would like to just thank you very, very much. It has been wonderful to see how everyone's work has developed in the years since we have seen you last. Some of you we've seen just recently, some of you it's been some years. But the developments are exciting, as we saw a move towards a discussion of the history of medical discourses on sex and sexuality in Armenian advice literature, to an inspiration to locate women in medieval Arabic, Georgian, and Armenian text, to a move from thinking about the Armeno-Turkic script to looking at Armenians' relation to the Turkish language, rather than a script itself, to poetic hermeneutics in an Anatolian practice of intertextuality, to representations of encounters in the context of intercommunal relations, the accidental and randomness of histories without beginnings and ends, couched in silences, the fascinating connection between the doctrine of incarnation and ecclesiastical debates of materiality, shifts from scribal to mechanical reproduction, confessionalism as the driving force of Armenian book history, and the early modern printing revolution to final diasporic materialities. So that was the day in a nutshell. In less than 5 minutes. I have some minutes to spare. And the most amazing thing for me is that you are all engaging in these fields and discussions that are so far outside of perhaps your intellectual comfort zone. You have conversations across times, space, disciplines. And you are generous with your time and with your comments. So much so that we had really a hard time keeping to our schedule, which I'm now making up for. And the conversation, of course, will be continued afterwards and in many forms, immediately, of course, over dinner. But I think I speak for all of us here at the University of Michigan, and for those of you who are now dispersed into the world, that ASB is really about community. So thank you all so much for coming out and having this wonderful conversation with me.